Hello and welcome to a Healthy Ireland at Your Library talk from Galway Public Libraries. We're here today in Westside Library with Dr. Mary McGill, PhD, who is a journalist, a researcher on digital culture, and the author of The Visibility Trap, Sexism, Surveillance and Social Media. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Dr. McGill is going to be talking to us about a number of issues, specifically social media and self-image in young women. She's going to be exploring how issues such as body image are impacted by technology like Instagram and TikTok. And she's going to look at ways in which social media companies might improve the experience of young users online. So thank you very much. I suppose to start with, your thesis when you were doing your PhD was on young women, selfies, self-image. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, wow, it wasn't that long ago, Caroline, but it feels like a long time ago, given everything that we've been through in the last 2 years. So my original degree was in media studies. So I was always fascinated by, obviously, the mechanics of media, how it works, but also the way the media kind of shapes our sense of self, like who we are as people, how we understand the world and our place in it. And of course, the big shift in media over the past 15 years or so has been social media. So we relied on, or we were, broadcasted to, so these legacy media institutions, from news to entertainment to everything else, and they turned out the media. Whereas all of a sudden, in terms of human history, this is a very, very short space of time, ordinary people have become broadcasters too, right? We can showcase our lives, record our lives, document our lives as never before. And this is a huge shift. So I always say in these conversations that we're in a communication sense, we're living through the biggest transformation since the Gutenberg press cranked up in the 15th century, right? So it's
very true.
Very true. So this is a time of huge change. And so in and around all that, I was noticing the kinds of explanations that were being offered up for the various new types of phenomena that we were seeing on the back of the rise of things like social media. And when it came to young women, thinking back to my media studies degree, there were all of these explanations, I use that in inverted commas because it hadn't been tested at this point, we didn't have time to do sufficient research and so on, that assumed that their fascination with things like the selfie, and there is research that shows that women have a kind of predilection for taking selfies. But this enthusiasm, this popularity of the selfie with young women had to do simply with narcissism, right? And that struck me as kind of too neat and too simple. First of all, as I said, we didn't have time at that point to really study in any significant way the links between narcissism and selfie taking, never mind the gender links between narcissism and selfie taking. Also, narcissism as a concept, as a clinical concept, is quite severe. Like narcissistic personality disorder is complicated to diagnose. It's not a generalized thing. And also behaviours that are just actually about having a good self-esteem or wanting to celebrate or record something that you're proud of can be interpreted online as being narcissistic. And also the way these technologies are designed kind of makes you engage in narcissistic behaviour because they're designed to focus entirely on the I, what I think, what my life is about, what I look like. That's the design of the technologies rather than the individual approaching them as somebody who is narcissistic.
Yes, so it is that me kind of focus.
Yes,
that I suppose is very frequently levelled against women and girls. They're vain and we are historically seen as visual because women have always been the object of attention.
Right.
So
yes. So my thesis was really drawn. It kind of developed from that idea of being like, well, we're making these assumptions. They're becoming circulated in the culture. The research in an academic sense is not necessarily there to back them up. In fact, we haven't had a chance to do a kind of meaningful, in-depth look at this.
Yes.
And one aspect of media studies, which is my background that I've always been fascinated by, is a kind of sub-branch called audience studies, where you go to an audience that consumes whatever it is, romance novels, comics, whatever, and you ask them. You say you inquire as to how they use these cultural products in the course of their lives. And when you do that, all kinds of interesting things emerge.
much.
right? Because the way we incorporate the media into our lives and culture into our lives can do so many different things. It can be quite a subjective thing, quite a personal thing. And so there's a real richness there when you go and you ask people. And invariably, when I did my interviews, that was part of what I wanted to do with Thesis. When I did my interviews, I began to see, now there's an element of self-selection at play. So because I put a call out for respondents, these young women wanted to talk, right? Like, if it had been a different group of young women, it might have been slightly different. But there's a real sense there. What I was struck by is what I was seeing was the exact opposite of narcissism. It was young women who were very aware of the ambiguities and the tensions on these digital spaces.
So kind of spending a lot of time touching up pictures and, you know, photoshopping effectively, you know, to look just right.
Exactly. And they were, you know, on the one hand, you know, living through this culture and embodying it. So, you know, it's part of their lives, but they also have kind of a critical awareness about it. They're aware. So my point being, the young women don't approach these activities necessarily unthinkingly. In fact, they think about them a lot. It's actually a really complicated way of being in the world. And I think for, you know, I'm the oldest side of the millennials, so I do remember a time when my life wasn't complicated by what I was going to put on social media. Whereas now, women who are just even 5-10 years younger than me, that is part of their lives. And I think sometimes we think, in being flippant and saying, oh, it's simply narcissism, we miss how actually complicated and strategic and how much psychological space it takes up to actually have this be part of your life. And that's what I was really struck by.
Is that what you mean by the visibility trap?
What I mean, so what I mean by the visibility trap, I suppose, if you think about what does social media demand from us, and what does social media give us? Well, it gives us visibility. It allows us to see other people as we would never normally see them before, and it allows ourselves and our lives to be seen in ways that would have been, as I said, unimaginable a generation ago. This ability to broadcast yourself, and there can be really positive effects to this. You can connect with people all over the world. If you're a creative person, you can show off your work. There's endless amounts of interesting and fun things that you can watch and observe online. In theory, all of human knowledge and history is on there. You can teach yourself a language, you can find community. Yes, there's positives. But visibility comes at a price, right? Where these technologies are technically free, but they're not so free in other ways. So they're not so free when it comes to how they commandeer our attention. They're not so free when it comes to the way they entice us to judge other people and to judge ourselves. And they can actually be the opposite of freedom given when they kind of lock us into a never-ending popularity contest, or when they come to dictate what our public reputation is. You know, there was a time, Caroline, when the only people really thinking about these things were celebrities.
Yes.
Whereas now, all of us, particularly young people, because so much of their social life, particularly over the last couple of years, has been online, are thinking about their public image in a way that, as I said, you know, that used to be the terrain of celebrities. We are undergoing this huge cultural shift now, where those types of norms have become mainstreamed, and at such a pace that they have actually outstripped, I think, adults' ability, government's ability, lawmakers' ability to keep pace. So the notion of the trap is to say visibility is what social media gives us, but visibility also makes us vulnerable. Yes. And when it comes to young women, and women broadly speaking, there are particular gendered aspects to that vulnerability that come with being so visible in these spaces.
Can you give us some examples of that?
So I'll begin by saying, and this can seem really counterintuitive, that none of this is new. So the trends and activities and behaviours that we see on social media are obviously, you know, the technology is new in certain respects, but the impulses and the culture from which they emerge it's really deep rooted. Okay, so I conceive of social media as kind of a new public space and a really important one, particularly as we've seen in Ireland over the last couple of years, the role that social media has played in various political movements and referendums. So, you know, it's been one of the kind of focal points where people have organised and expressed themselves and everything else. But the public space has often treated women advocating for their rights through it and trying to access it to exercise those rights with a deep degree of suspicion, and in the worst instances with actual hostility up to and including violence, even death is something of the most extreme.
Yes.
And so in the book, I look at examples of, female Victorian cyclists who, I know it seems mad by today's standards, although I should point out that there are still parts of the world today where women are not allowed to cycle. Okay, just to point that out and to be mindful of that. It seems outrageous by our standards that people would pull women off bicycles and then threaten them with physical violence for cycling down the street. But that such was the threat of this new form of independence given by the bicycle, and it was associated with the suffragette movement as well. This is what these women in this physical type of public sphere had to deal with.
So women being out, being in a public space, and also being independent, because the bicycle gave them a mobility they wouldn't previously have had. They were no longer dependent on someone bringing them somewhere. They could go by themselves. They could meet in groups and interact in ways that they hadn't done before.
100%. So if we actually think of technology as a tool that allows human beings to gain mastery over their surroundings, then the bicycle is a tool. Ultimately, it's a tool in the way that social media also enables women now, as never before, to express themselves, to organise themselves, to create images of themselves that talk back. For a long time, for most of kind of living in industrial societies, images created of women were created by men, often for other men, but even for other women. So it was through a very particular type of gaze. And that gaze hasn't gone away, but the potential for greater diversity and also for women to talk back and contest those idealized notions of womanhood are enabled now, thankfully, by the internet, by social media.
But those interactions, social media has changed those interactions as well, because while it gives women the opportunity to speak back, it also enables another kind of interaction as well.
Yes, this is the heart of the visibility trap. It's in the moment that you exercise that agency, you're also opening you up, you're also exposing yourself to the potential for that long-standing kind of strain of who does she think she is-ism to come roaring at you. And what is different about social media is, you can't simply go home and close the door. Social media gives people visibility as never before, but it also makes them more visible than ever before, which allows people to access them in ways that would have been unthinkable, again, even a generation ago. So where you have women perhaps organising online and talking about issues specific to them, those conversations and that activity can be surveyed, it can be watched, it can be interrupted, it can be derailed and so on, in a way that couldn't really happen if you were down at a community centre. That community centre might be very difficult for some of those women to get to. You don't have that problem with the internet or social media. However, that same accessibility also emboldens and enables bad actors who actually are there to disrupt rather than support. And of course, for people, and sadly, they are still out there, who view the kind of rights claims that women continue to make today, quite rightly, with suspicion, this can be as useful a tool for them as it is for us.
Yes, very much so. And I mean, I suppose we've seen that with, I know I think she's an Australian woman who tried to set up a women's only app, for women to have safe space, and immediately was hit with lots of, men trying to get online into it. Again, the concept of women having safe spaces to just be away, not that I don't think it wasn't political, it was just that concept of women or being together without men in the mix seems very threatening to some men. We know that NUIG did a study on female politicians and the harassment they experience, and that really very, very extreme death threats, rape threats, all these kind of things being levelled against women who are willing to operate in the public sphere. And that is the negative side, but I mean there are huge positives. There is, as you say, that sense of community, there's everything else, but I think if we bring it back to the impact maybe that social media has on body image, because this is one thing that particularly impacts young women and girls, because social media is showing this sort of idealized, very controlled image of what a woman is, how we're supposed to look. Can you talk a little bit about what we know about how social media impacts body image?
Well, I think critical in talking about all of these things is to, as much as social media is part of it, what we're talking about today. Very often when we're looking at those phenomena online, we actually need to take a step back. We need to kind of think in broad trends. And we know that broadly speaking, we'll say teenage years, older, into your early 20s and so on, there can be a peak time for body image issues. Yes. It has always been thus. Women's bodies are changing, often rapidly, often dramatically. Yeah. And it can be a very difficult time in your own body. That is not helped then by a media culture that has always been fascinated and very active in pushing certain notions of what a female body should look like, or a feminized body should look like, right? So it's always, and the irony of all this, of course, is that we can see how it changes over time. What a body should have looked like in the turn of the 20th century is quite different to what you would have had in the 90s, which is different again to what you have now online. It's almost as if we can't win, Caroline, I don't know. But, so you get this kind of, you have this pre-existing culture that is on fire, and along comes the petrol, that is social media. And I think when we're talking about these things, we need to realise that there are certain young women who are particularly vulnerable because they may have particular, vulnerabilities or experiences around their bodies that make them particularly susceptible to the likes of images that they see on Instagram. Okay, so that's the kind of awareness that we need to bring, as in, like, these places are not particularly healthy or helpful for anyone who's feeling a little bit vulnerable at that stage in their life, just like a magazine wouldn't have been either. But for some young women who perhaps more inclined to compare themselves to other people, who perhaps don't have the same support network offline as other young women do, who perhaps for whatever reason having to do with their home life spend excessive amounts of time in these spaces, that leaves them more vulnerable to having, with the way the images circulate, the types of images compound perhaps how they're already feeling about themselves. So it's that, sometimes we talk about social media as causing these things. That's actually quite hard to prove. What seems to be the case is that if you have these particular vulnerabilities, it can exacerbate them, but it also depends on how you're using the technology. And I think that kind of nuanced, measured, critical kind of awareness is something we really need to be giving to young people. To say to them, well, if you feel like spending all this time on Instagram, why do you think that is? What is, because we all like looking at pretty pictures. We do. Human beings are intensely visual. But what is it you're looking for, that you're trying to find through social media? And answering that question probably begins long before social media.
I suppose that's true, because historically, girls have tended to, one, reflect whatever society expects of them at a particular time, but they've also been, I suppose, shown to be susceptible to contagion of ideas. If you think back to, say, the Salem witch trials, where you had one or two people, and then all of a sudden you have an entire community of girls who were saying, well, I'm being pricked in the night by pins, and in the 70s and 80s there was anorexia everywhere. There are various things, and I suppose with social media, because it's so visible, as you say, you can't close the door, you can't switch off. When we were growing up, if you made a mistake, it might be talked about in town for a week, but then someone else made a mistake and that became the topic of conversation, and it was forgotten about. Whereas now there's a very high chance it will be picked up on a camera somewhere, it will be uploaded to social media, and it's never going to go away.
No. This is it. I think one of the philosophers that I quote in the book is a French philosopher called Michel Foucault, and he came up with this theory of panopticism that has to do with surveillance. But one of the things he says about living in a panopticon, this type of prisons built around surveillance, is that it creates an archive without end. And he he couldn't have predicted social media, but sometimes when I'm looking what goes on social media, and I think particularly for young people who are growing up in these spaces, I just think of that phrase and I'm like, oh my gosh. But yes, I mean, there is research around the issue of social contagion that definitely happens online, and we need more research on it. But what the researchers tend to find is that some people are more susceptible to notion of contagion than others. And I remember the first time I began to read that research, I personally found it so kind of empowering, because I was like, well, maybe I need to actually pay attention to my own mood, or am I tired, am I having a bad day? And, you know, sometimes you kind of think you fall into the endless doom scroll, but maybe you don't fall. Like, maybe there's something motivating that we all kind of need to build an awareness of, that might help us, you know, kind of figure out, you know, why am I compelled to click on that rather than that? What is it about me that this technology is preying on? And I think that notion of preying is key as well. So if you go back to the Instagram example for a second, you know, all of these platforms are governed by algorithms. So you're a young woman who is having some insecurities around your body. You go on Instagram and you look up, one day you look up diet tips or something similar. But the algorithm, being the algorithm, is a blunt instrument. So it thinks, oh, this user wants diet material. And so it begins to give you more and more of what you want, because that's what it thinks you want. But that can have truly awful, unattended, but not good consequences if you're someone who feels vulnerable, and that kind of content is the last thing that you need to see. The algorithm is doing what it's programmed to do, but it's having the opposite effect of actually being beneficial.
So you looked for diet tips, and then you get this constant reinforcement of diet and, you know, body image. And then if you're susceptible, you're going, so even the app thinks I'm fat. You know, I need to change my body. And there's this constant, you should look like this, you should eat these foods. And
it's not even that the app thinks you're fat. It's that often we're not even aware that we're using an app. It's because if you think of these experiences as frictionless and almost natural feeling. So there's a great paper that I quote in the book that describes social media as an iceberg. So the bit we see is only the very tip of it, but there's all of this stuff going on, all these weighting mechanisms and tracking mechanisms going on underneath, and that is determining what you see. But we're not aware of that. So you're a young woman looking at all this material that's been given to you, and you're not thinking to yourself, what is it trying to tell me? Why are you giving me that? Like, what are you know? You're thinking, oh, this is more. This is, you know, wow, look at this. Yes. And there's a real sophistication to a lot of this material as well, because it's not as blunt as an advertisement. It's, you know, often young women that you would, a couple of years older, who you would aspire to be, and they appear much more ordinary and accessible. You know, with the notion of influencers and content creators than, you know, a supermodel might have on the cover of Vogue in the 90s for me, we'll say.
Yes.
You know, there's a kind of, I don't know that it's necessarily true, but there's a perception that distance has collapsed, right? That these people are, you know, you can achieve this too, because this person who's almost just like you has achieved it too. And that is a heady mix. I mean, just as I'm describing it to you now, I'm like, that's a lot. I mean, I'm just thinking, back in the day, I would have read my magazine. There would have been definitely moments where I would have been like, oh God, look, you know, whatever.
I've done that.
But yeah, I close the magazine and walk away.
Yes.
The culture is saturated with these images, don't get me wrong, but it is not equivalent to this back mirror in your hand that you've with you 24/7, and these algorithms that are giving you what you want. These social spaces where all your friends are hanging out, where your interactions are being conducted through ranking mechanisms, like shares or complete silence. So it's tough out there.
Yeah, very, very much so. And when you talk there, just, you know, about the likes and shares and the popularity, I mean, what are some things that parents need to be aware of in relation to these kind of sites and how they function? Because a lot of parents, you know, they wouldn't be on Instagram and TikTok and whatnot, or they may have heard of them, but they wouldn't necessarily be using them themselves. So what kind of things should parents be aware of?
I think to go back to my point earlier on about how it actually begins long before social media, I think it's really hard for parents because we didn't grow up with, I'm a media studies professional, but media literacy is not necessarily something that's mainstreamed in the curriculum. It should be, I believe, and there should be far more supports for parents. But I think if parents realise that, you know, at least part of how we use social media has to do sometimes, the research suggests, with things that we are dissatisfied with, or we turn to social media because our home life is not, you know, satisfying us or giving or meeting our needs in some way. And even to have conversations with your, you know, sons and daughters around that and be like, you know, when you're approaching these technologies, be aware they're trying to exploit you, right? They want your attention. And sadly, because of the way the human brain is designed, it's often negativity that grabs our attention, right? Advertising is most effective when it makes us feel bad about ourselves and then offers us a solution to supposedly make us feel better about ourselves. Social media is no different, okay? It's a weird mix of really sophisticated forms of advertising mixed with our social life and our professional life and so on. And say to them, you know, that this technology is not neutral. It's trying to capture your attention. If you feel bad, have that awareness before you go on there, because quite likely it will make you feel worse. And I would say to parents, in the same way I would say to my students or anyone else, this technology can be really useful if you are aware and strategic about how you use it. So setting limits, you know, it may be that you have a really nice time on Instagram because of who you follow. It can be highly selective. Curate. If you're following accounts that make you feel bad, but you really enjoy accounts that cover nice food or accounts that are all about reading, great. Get rid of the bad stuff, keep positive stuff. Yeah, and feel empowered to do that, you know. And also, you know, the awareness you don't have to be on all of these apps. And I know that can feel like social suicide for some people, but even saying to them, you can be like, this is your life, this is your well-being. You've got the right to be like, is this adding to my life or is it taking from my life? Is it giving me energy or is it taking my energy? And I think that kind of awareness is something that young people need it, but we all need it, you know. So it is, I think, about building that kind of critical media literacy, as in these are products, they're designed to steal your attention, they can be useful, figure out how they're useful and fun for you, and then minimize in as much as you can the downsides, and we're here to help you with that. And talk to us, you know, tell, you know, what you enjoy, what you don't enjoy. And if there are periods or moods or times when you feel yourself more inclined to spend time on these platforms, talk to us about that as well. That's what I would say to parents, because it begins before the internet.
And so what is it that social media companies need to do to improve the user experience?
Well, some people would say that they shouldn't be targeting on anybody under the age of 18 years old. Okay, that, you know, there's so much that we need to understand about the role of these social media companies on developing minds and developing emotions. There are also those who would say that if 13 is going to be the age at which people are allowed to join platforms, that companies need to be absolutely assured that the people that are allowed joining at 13 are in fact 13, right, and not younger. There was also the question of data, young people's data, right? So earlier on I mentioned the archive without end. You know, young people now are growing up in public in a way that I don't think us older people can even imagine, right? So that idea that young people are entitled to privacy, and that at some point, you know, that they should be allowed to go, well, that was my youthful exuberance or whatever, and I can take it off the web, or I can control what happens to it, and I don't have to be, you know, it doesn't have to necessarily follow me, or be something that I'm afraid of lurking out there, or indeed, in the case of young women putting up pictures of themselves, be used in nefarious and nasty ways by bad actors who project all kinds of disgusting meanings onto pictures that are taken in pure innocence.
So, like Google's right to be forgotten, that
absolutely.
The social media companies should have a quick and easy way for people to delete all of their historic content and be given a do-over.
Yes, particularly for young people. There's also the question of the algorithms as well, and how they are designed. So this notion of giving you more of what you want. In theory, if it's an Amazon, you know, have you read this next list? I mean, fine, but not so when you're dealing with sensitive issues around young people and body image, or young people and relationships and so on. There's, you know, the sophistication of these algorithms would say to me that if all these very clever people got to put their heads together, they could come up with more sophisticated algorithms again that could be far more balanced, right, in terms of what they're presenting on these screens as natural or inevitable. But I think the main thing is to say to parents, you know, so much of this begins and is about developing a kind of a mindful, critical self-awareness before you go online, right? It's about being aware that these things are products, they're there to capture your attention, to sell you certain things. They're very sophisticated forms of advertising that feel like they're part of your social life, feel like they're part of your professional life, and they are. They're bound up within it. So it's about saying to, you know, the likes of the Facebooks of the world, who had their famous founding motto, move fast and break things, be like, that's not acceptable anymore. If the things you're breaking are young people's mental health, if it's young people's ability to move through the world freely, without shame, you know, it's not necessarily down to one company, but it is contributing to a culture. that can have really detrimental effects. So, you know, less of breaking things and more of adding value to people's lives. That's what these products should be about.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much, Mary. Mary's book, The Visibility Trap, Sexism, Surveillance and Social Media, is available in Galway Public Libraries. Mary, thank you so much for a really wonderful session. It was really engaging, really interesting, and we look forward to talking with you again soon.
Thank you so much.